It all started at a family barbecue. One of those picture-perfect afternoons where the smoke from the grill danced through the air, and the laughter was just loud enough to mask the tension simmering underneath. My name's Natalie. And that day changed everything. My mother-in-law, Jeanne, stood near the patio with her ever-present glass of Chardonnay, eyes scanning the backyard like a queen surveying her kingdom. I always admired her, sharp, elegant, generous to a fault. She was the kind of woman who sent handwritten thank you notes and remembered everyone's birthdays, and for the 10 years I'd been married to her son, I truly thought she saw me as a daughter. But that illusion shattered when I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. I ducked into the kitchen to grab more napkins when I heard my sister-in-law Monica whispering in the hallway. Mom said we're getting everything now. She changed the will. Natalie and the kids aren't even mentioned. The napkin slipped from my hand. I froze, heart pounding, suddenly hyper-aware of every word tumbling from Monica's lips. She said Natalie's just the daughter-in-law, not blood. And now that David's gone, there's no reason to keep her in it. My husband, David, had died just 6 months earlier in a car accident. We were still grieving. I was still getting used to sleeping in a bed that felt too big, raising our 2 boys without their father and pretending like I was okay when I could barely breathe. And now, the woman I had called Mom for a decade had decided that my children, her grandchildren, no longer mattered. I stumbled out of the hallway before they saw me, my stomach churning. Was this real? Had Jean really erased us from her will? I didn't want to believe it. Not from her. Not after everything. She was the one who told me to always think of this family as your own. The one who brought soup when I was sick and babysat the boys just to give me a break. I trusted her. I loved her. But as I watched her that afternoon, laughing with Monica, pouring drinks for her son Mark, who barely visited unless money was involved, I saw something I hadn't before. A coldness in her eyes when they flicked over me. An emptiness that hadn't been there when David was alive. And that's when I realized I was disposable. The warmth had only extended as far as David. Without him, I was just an outsider again. I left that party early, clutching the boys' hands, trying to smile so they wouldn't see the storm brewing inside me. But in that silence, as I drove home, something shifted. This wasn't just about a will. This was about betrayal. About being cast aside like I never mattered. About my sons being denied the legacy their father would have wanted them to have. It would have been easy to walk away, to say, let them have their money and keep my dignity. But it wasn't about money anymore. It was about justice. And if Jean thought she could rewrite the story, pretend we were never part of it, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Because I was done playing the grateful daughter-in-law. I was going to find out the truth. And when I did, they were all going to see the real Natalie. The days that followed were a blur of anger and disbelief. I couldn't shake Monica's words. Every time I looked at my boys, Liam and Noah, my heart broke all over again. They were just 6 and 9, too young to understand inheritance or betrayal. But one day, they'd grow up and wonder why their father's family had nothing to do with them. And I wasn't going to have an answer unless I found out the truth. I didn't want to act on a rumor, but something inside me knew Monica hadn't been bluffing. So I started with the obvious. I called Jean. I kept my voice steady, calm, almost warm. Hey, Jean, I wanted to ask, David and I had talked a lot about the future, especially for the boys. I remember he said something about the family trust. There was a pause. So long I thought the line had dropped. Then her voice came clipped and suddenly formal. Oh, that's all been handled. Nothing you need to worry about, Natalie. Nothing I needed to worry about? I blinked. I'm not asking for me. I just want to make sure the boys... They'll be fine, she interrupted sharply. You're young. You'll figure things out. David would want you to move forward. That last line twisted like a knife. David would want you to move forward, as if erasing his children from their own family was some kind of mercy. I hung up with my stomach in knots. I didn't have proof yet, but the message was clear. We were out. That night, I pulled out everything David and I had ever discussed. About finances, wills, trusts, anything that might give me a paper trail. When he was alive, we'd had open conversations about setting up college funds, and how he wanted the family lake house to go to our boys one day. He'd said his parents had a will that reflected that, and even mentioned Jean had told him she'd made it fair for everyone. But now, I wasn't sure what fair meant anymore. I called a friend of mine, Rachel, whose husband was an estate lawyer. She listened quietly as I told her everything, then said, "Natalie, if Jean changed her will, that's her legal right. But if David had assets or trusts in place with your kids as beneficiaries, and she tampered with anything, that's a whole different issue." Tampered. That word lit a fire inside me. Because it wasn't just that Jean had removed us. It was how easily she'd done it, like we were obstacles to sweep aside. I started digging. Emails. Old files David had stored in the cloud. I remembered he had scanned some legal documents when we moved, and sure enough, I found a digital copy of a trust, one Jean had signed as part of her estate plan 6 years ago. Back then, David was listed as one of the executors, and Liam and Noah were specifically named as beneficiaries. But that was 6 years ago, before Jean changed everything. What I needed now was the updated version, the one Monica had bragged about. And that's when I realized the real problem wasn't just the betrayal, it was the silence. John had closed ranks. Monica and Mark were circling the wagons. David was gone. No one was going to help me uncover the truth. I was alone in this. And the more I pushed, the more I felt the walls closing in. Jean stopped answering my calls. Monica blocked me entirely. Mark, who hadn't said more than 5 words to me in years, sent a snide email. "Maybe it's time to let go, Natalie. You're not part of this family anymore." It was like they were trying to erase us. But I wasn't going to be erased. They thought I would quietly fade away. They forgot who I was. I might have been grieving, but I wasn't broken. And if they thought they could bury the "it's one" thing to be left out, it's another to be erased. What Jean had done, what she was trying to do, wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, identity, and stripping my sons of the place they were born into. David may have been gone, but his blood ran through Liam and Noah. His name, his history, everything he stood for, it lived in them. And Jean? She was trying to pretend they didn't exist. I couldn't stop thinking about what David would say if he could see this now. He adored his mother, always defending her even when she could be cold or controlling. But more than anything, he loved his boys. He would have never allowed them to be treated like this. So I had to do what he couldn't anymore. Fight for them. This wasn't about getting a piece of a will. It was about preserving their future. Because here's the ugly truth. That no one tells you when you lose your husband young. The world stops seeing you as family. Overnight you go from one of us to someone else. Your grief becomes inconvenient. Your presence, unwelcome. I saw it in the way Jean looked through me. In how Monica and Mark started posting pictures online with captions like, "Just the real family now." I didn't care about the jewelry or the property or the money, but I cared that Liam and Noah would grow up wondering why their grandparents disappeared after their dad died. I cared that one day, when they asked me why their cousins inherited the lake house while they got nothing, I wouldn't have to lie. And that trust I found in David's old files, it was my key to proving something wasn't right. Because if Jean had changed the will after David died, and knowingly removed his children from legal agreements they were originally part of, then this wasn't just cruel. It could be legally challengeable. Rachel confirmed it. If she revoked a trust that explicitly listed your children as beneficiaries, and David didn't consent to that change, or wasn't alive to, then depending on the state laws, you might have a case. A case. I wasn't litigious by nature, but suddenly the idea of a court forcing Jean to explain herself didn't sound like war. It sounded like justice. Still, I hesitated. Legal battles are messy, expensive, and deeply emotional. The last thing I wanted was to drag the boys through months, maybe years, of conflict. But then something happened that solidified my decision. Noah came home from school one afternoon, quiet and distant. He had drawn a family tree in class. The assignment was simple: include parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles. But on the page, Jean's name was missing. So were Monica and Mark. When I asked him why, he just said, "They don't want us, right?" I couldn't speak. My throat tightened. "Noah," I whispered. But he looked away. I had no answer for him, and that silence said it all. That night, I made my decision. This wasn't about winning a legal fight. It was about showing my sons that we don't let people walk over us, that they mattered, that their father's family couldn't rewrite the story just to suit themselves. I was going to get a copy of the new will. I was going to prove what Jean had done, and I was going to make sure everyone saw exactly who she had become. The woman who toasted my engagement with tears in her eyes. The woman who held my hand when David was in the hospital. The woman who swore she'd always be there for her grandkids. She had buried all of that. But I was going to dig it up and expose everything. Because when you mess with a mother protecting her kids, you don't just get revenge. You get reckoning. I knew I couldn't just accuse Jean outright. She'd deny everything and close ranks even tighter. If I wanted to prove what she had done, if I wanted to challenge the new will or any alterations to the trust, I needed solid, undeniable proof. Not assumptions, not gossip, paper. So the plan had to be smart, calculated, and quiet. First, I reached back out to Rachel. She wasn't just a lawyer's wife. She used to work in estate planning before she had her kids. And she agreed to help me find my footing. "Start with the county probate records," she said. "If Jean's filed the new will already, there should be a record of it. If not, there may be a trust document registered somewhere, depending on how her assets are structured." We spent 3 nights combing through online databases and public court documents. Jean had a trust account listed in her name, tied to 2 properties and a few investment portfolios. The most recent modification had been filed just 2 months after David died. My heart sank. 2 months. While I was still barely functioning, still in therapy, still sleeping in David's old t-shirts and crying myself to sleep. Jean had been in an attorney's office, rewriting her legacy like we never existed. That filing was my first break. I called the county clerk's office and requested access to the public record. Since Jean hadn't passed away yet, the will itself wasn't public, but the trust amendment was. And that document confirmed what Monica had let slip. The trust no longer named Liam and Noah as beneficiaries. Instead, it left everything to Monica and Mark equally. But what struck me most? David's name had been removed entirely. Even though he had been a co-trustee, even though his kids were still alive, he was erased like he never existed. It was cold, calculated, and possibly fraudulent. Rachel explained that if the original trust was irrevocable, or had protections meant to preserve David's share for his descendants, then removing him and his children could raise serious legal questions, but I needed more. I needed the original documents, signed copies. Ones Jean couldn't claim were drafts or outdated ideas. I remember David had printed some hard copies and stored them in a locked cabinet in our basement, one I hadn't touched since he passed. I spent an entire afternoon down there, going through every folder until I found it. There it was, the original estate trust plan. David's name, my sons' names, detailed asset division, handwritten notes, Jean's signature. It was all there. That was when my grief turned into resolve. She hadn't just changed her will. She had dismantled her son's legacy while pretending to grieve him. That night, I sat down and wrote a letter to Jean, not angry, not emotional. Just a single-page request for a meeting to discuss estate matters on behalf of the children. She ignored it, so I sent another. Certified mail. This time, Mark responded, through a lawyer. The letter was formal, stiff, and full of legalese. Our client is under no obligation to respond to unsubstantiated claims regarding her estate. Further contact may be considered harassment. That's when I knew they were scared. They didn't expect me to come at them prepared. They expected a grieving widow, docile, emotional, vulnerable. Instead, they got a woman with documentation, legal support, and a plan. Rachel helped me draft a preliminary notice of intent to challenge the trust revision, citing the original version and David's designation as a co-trustee. I wasn't launching a lawsuit yet, but I was letting them know. I had the receipts, and I was ready to go to court. The silence that followed was telling. No smug responses from Mark, no snide calls from Monica. Jean didn't even try to reach out. They were regrouping, probably calling lawyers, trying to figure out how much. I knew how far I'd take it. But they underestimated me again. Because this wasn't just a threat. This was war, and I had just fired the first shot. Once I made my move, the game shifted. At first, it was quiet, eerily so. But beneath that silence, I could feel the storm building. I kept my head down, knowing that if I wanted justice, I couldn't afford even the smallest mistake. This wasn't just a family spat anymore. It was a legal battle that could reshape my son's future. I started with documentation. Every phone call, every email, every piece of correspondence, saved, printed, filed. Rachel helped me create a legal timeline, from the original trust formation to David's death, to Jean's revisions. Every date mattered. Every omission had weight. The more I gathered, the more I realized just how deliberate this erasure was. Jean hadn't just removed David and the boys. She'd shifted all assets into a separate trust under Monica and Mark's control, a move that could be challenged if done under suspicious circumstances, especially without proper notice to named beneficiaries. I consulted with a probate attorney. Rachel recommended someone who specialized in trust disputes. His name was Brian Lowell. Sharp, no nonsense, and quietly fierce. He reviewed everything. His verdict? "You have a strong case," he said. "It's not just the removal of your sons, it's the timing. 2 months after David's death, she revised the trust completely, with no notification to you or the other listed beneficiaries. If the court sees this as a violation of fiduciary duty, or as undue influence, it could be reversed or at least challenged." It wasn't a promise, but it was a path. And now that I had legal ground, it was time to turn up the pressure. Step 1. Make it known. I didn't go public, not yet. But I started planting seeds where it would sting. At a family gathering I was shockingly still invited to, likely out of obligation, I made sure to drop the news gently. "We've hired counsel to review David's trust. There are some inconsistencies I'm concerned about." The looks on Monica and Mark's faces were priceless. That smug, untouchable confidence, gone in a flash. Step 2. Expose the hypocrisy. I gathered old voicemails and texts from Jean to David, ones where she spoke about ensuring the grandkids' legacy, or where she praised our parenting and talked about how much the boys meant to her. I gave those to Brian, who said they could be powerful in court if we needed to show her intent prior to David's death versus her actions afterward. Step 3. Follow the money. Rachel and I began digging into property records and asset transfers. One thing stood out. A property that had belonged to Jean for decades had been quietly signed over to Mark and Monica's holding company. It had happened just weeks after the trust amendment. Suspicious? Absolutely. Brian agreed. That timing helps establish that the changes weren't made out of necessity or estate planning prudence. It looks like asset shielding. If we can show it was an intentional effort to disinherit without legal standing, the court could claw that back. The pieces were coming together. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was building a case, one that couldn't be ignored. And while all this was happening, I made sure Liam and Noah were protected. I opened separate custodial accounts for them, started planning a college fund independent of any inheritance. I didn't want them growing up feeling like victims. I wanted them to see a mother who fought back, who didn't let grief swallow her, who didn't let people rewrite history. I also prepared myself mentally. Legal battles are exhausting. They test your resolve, your patience, your belief in justice. But I had my sons, and I had the truth. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to burn bridges. All I had to do was keep walking forward, one deliberate step at a time. And the best part? Jean's silence was starting to crack. Monica's husband reached out to me out of nowhere. He wanted to clarify a few things, said there had been misunderstandings, and that no one wanted to hurt the kids. I told him kindly but firmly that the time for clarifying had passed. Now, I was only interested in consequences, and they were coming. The letter from Jean's attorney came on a Monday morning, thick envelope, formal language, a veiled threat dressed as civility. But there it was, an invitation to mediate privately before any formal proceedings commenced. Translation: they were scared. I took it to Brian. He read through the offer, eyes sharp. They want to settle, he said. This isn't about resolving a family matter anymore. This is damage control. They know a court would tear this apart. We scheduled the mediation. It was to be held at a neutral law office downtown, and though I had imagined some dramatic courtroom showdown, this was quieter, more surgical, but no less satisfying. When I walked into that conference room and saw Jean sitting stiffly at the table, flanked by her lawyers and Mark on one side, Monica on the other, I felt something shift in me. Power. For the first time since David's death, I didn't feel like I was playing defense. I wasn't that fragile widow, fumbling through grief. I was the mother of David's children, and I was there to make damn sure they got what they deserved. The mediator laid out the rules. Brian presented our case like a surgeon wielding a scalpel, precise, calm, devastating. He presented the original trust documents, the timeline, the suspicious property transfers, the correspondence, the removal of David's name, the pattern of erasure. He concluded simply, this wasn't estate planning. It was a calculated effort to remove Natalie and her children from the family legacy, made without legal justification, and under questionable motivations. Jean didn't look at me once, but Monica did. Her face was pale. Mark looked furious, but not surprised. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I told them what Noah said that day, how he didn't include them on the family tree because they don't want us, right? I watched Jean's face twitch at that. For a second, something flickered. Shame? Regret? I'll never know. But it was too late. I'm not here for revenge, I said. I'm here for truth. You may have hated me. Maybe you never thought I belonged in this family, but David loved his children. And what you did, what you tried to erase, it was cruel. And I won't let it stand. Silence. Then John spoke. Her voice was thin, trembling. I didn't think you'd fight this hard. I leaned forward. You should have. By the end of that mediation, an agreement was reached, not out of mercy, but necessity. The original trust was partially reinstated. A new fund was established in Liam and Noah's names, with oversight to prevent further manipulation. The properties that had been illegally moved were pulled back and split between all grandchildren, not just Monica and Mark's kids. Jean signed it. Not once did she apologize. But that didn't matter anymore, because when I walked out of that room, I didn't feel vindicated because I won something material. I felt powerful because I didn't back down. I exposed them. I forced them to face what they'd done. And I did it all without lowering myself to their level. Liam and Noah would grow up knowing the truth. They'd know their dad had loved them. They'd know their place in the world hadn't been taken away without a fight. And most importantly, they'd know that their mother never let them be erased. In the months that followed, Jean distanced herself even further. She stopped sending holiday cards. Monica and Mark went silent on social media. The whole perfect family image cracked, and I didn't need to lift a finger to finish the damage. Truth did that on its own. Sometimes karma doesn't look like a meltdown. Sometimes it looks like silence, isolation, loss of control. They tried to rewrite the story, and in the end, the ink turned on them. And me? I moved on. I rebuilt my life, stronger, steadier. I set up a trust for Liam and Noah that no one else could touch. I started teaching them about value, not just financial, but emotional. And one day, when they're older, I'll tell them the whole story, how they almost lost everything, and how we got it back. Together.